Welcome to Mr. Recaps, the easiest way to unwind with your favorite movies. Fast, clear, and full of the best moments. A night train full of passengers is traveling from London to Tunbridge Wells. The conductor announces the upcoming stops over the PA system and asks the passengers to have their tickets ready for inspection. Among the passengers is Dr. Luis Shear, who is on his way home with his little son Max. Luis, tired, falls asleep while Max entertains himself with his toys. Luis soon wakes up, surprised to discover that they still haven't left London. Seizing the moment, Max suggests playing rock, paper, scissors. Luis agrees on the condition that Max sleep for a little while. Afterward, just as they begin to play, Luis receives a phone call. The carriage is too noisy, so he enters the lobby where a colleague informs him that there has been a serious accident and that many patients are being taken to the hospital, so they need his help. During the call, Luis notices a friendly-looking woman named Sarah, who works as an event organizer, talking with Max as he plays. Max accidentally knocks over his coffee cup and spills it on his coat. Luis returns to the carriage and apologizes to Sarah for the ruined coat, offering to cover the cost of cleaning it. Sarah jokes that he could buy her a new coat to make up for it, and then laughs, saying it's not a big deal because she's just had a difficult day. Luis and Sarah continue chatting and clearly get along well. After a while, Max shows Sarah his drawings and she looks at them with interest. Then her friend calls and Sarah gets distracted by the conversation while Luis browses through a newspaper he borrowed from another passenger. Meanwhile, Max, still playing, notices a note from a passenger named Janowski, performing a magic trick with a cigarette that disappears after a few seconds. Frightened by Janowski's expression, Max turns to his father, and then the ticket inspector comes to check the tickets and notices the cigarette in Janowski's hand, asking him to throw it away. A conflict arises between them and all the passengers watch to see how it will end. Finally, Janowski throws the cigarette out of the carriage and admits that he is traveling without a ticket. Meanwhile, Max picks up his toy again and begins playing with it right next to the seat door. His father warns him that it is dangerous, but Max does not listen. Suddenly, the door opens at full speed and fortunately, Luis manages to grab his son just in time to prevent him from falling. Frightened, Luis yells at Max, snatches his toy away, and tells him to remain still. After calming down a bit, Luis gently explains to Max that his way of playing nearly hurt him badly and asks him to be more careful. At that moment, the ticket inspector comes to check the tickets and also suggests seating the child for safety. Sarah intervenes, pointing out that they should be more concerned about having automatic locks on the doors. The conductor asks if Sarah is Max's mother, and Max quickly responds that his mother is no longer alive. Meanwhile, as the train continues its journey, and the number of passengers in the carriages begins to decrease, at one of the stops, Luis notices that a strange man wearing a helmet gets off the train, but soon returns and enters the lobby. Luis and Max fall asleep for a moment, and during that time, someone attacks the conductor at the next stop. Luis wakes up and the passengers realize that they are the only ones left in their carriage. They continue chatting and Sarah shares that she recently broke up with her boyfriend and that her friends organized a party in London to help her get over it. Luis complains about his ungrateful job. Suddenly, Sarah mentions that the stain on her coat probably won't come out and that she is ready to accept his cleaning offer, clearly using this as an excuse to give Luis her phone number, and then suggests that he rest, promising to wake him before the stop. She puts on her headphones to listen to music. After a while, Luis wakes up startled by a sudden stop. Looking out the window, he sees a man in a high-visibility jacket and a wounded man on the track. As the train begins to move again, Luis tells Sarah that he will return soon and heads off to find the conductor to report the strange incident. In the lobby, he encounters Janowski, the passenger traveling without a ticket, and then discovers that the conductor cannot hear the call at the door. Another passenger, Peter Michael, comes out of his compartment and asks what is happening. Worried, he explains that there is a person injured on the tracks who might have been hit by the train and that this should be reported to the conductor. However, Peter does not consider it an emergency and simply suggests calling an ambulance. Luis does so and then returns with Sarah and Max, who are still playing. Finally, they approach their stop and prepare to disembark. Luis decides to ask another passenger in a compartment if they have seen the conductor or the ticket inspector, but Lane Middleton replies that she has not. As they prepare to part ways, Sarah gives Luis a goodbye kiss and reminds him that she has his number, but then the train does not stop. Luis leaves Max and Sarah in the compartment with Lane and heads to the conductor. Along the way, he receives a call from a colleague informing him that he will not arrive on time. Then he enters the conductor's compartment, uses the internal communication system to contact the conductor, and reminds him that they missed a stop while mentioning the person on the tracks. The conductor seems indifferent and only asks how many passengers remain on the train. Luis replies that there are 6, and the communication ends abruptly. Searching among the conductor's belongings, Luis finds a key and attempts to open the rear door of the train, but is unsuccessful. Peter notices and warns Luis that he will call the police if he continues causing trouble. An irritated Luis explains that the conductor skipped the stop. At that moment, they are interrupted by a deafening horn sound. Luis returns to the carriage and reaches for the emergency brake. Peter tries to stop him, but Luis pushes him. Peter then realizes that the train also missed its stop and engages another emergency brake, but neither brake works, and the train continues to accelerate. Realizing that something is wrong, Luis and Peter try pulling other emergency brake levers, but none work. At that moment, Yankovsky joins them, confused about what is happening. Luis realizes that the brakes have no pressure and suspects that the man in the orange vest he saw earlier might have tampered with them. Suddenly, Peter notices that Janovsky is wearing a similar vest under his jacket. Janovsky explains that he works as a cleaner for the London Metro and insists that he did not get off the train or touch the brakes. In response to their accusations, he suggests that the same person controlling the train instead of the conductor released the brake pressure. The men are astonished by this possibility. While Peter calls the transport police, Luis recalls that this train can operate in both directions, which means that there could be a locomotive in operation with brakes at the rear of the train. He tries again to open the rear door, but the keys do not fit. They look on confused by his futile attempts, wondering why Luis does not simply go to the conductor. Then Peter appears in the corridor advising against touching the door in order to avoid interfering with the police investigation. Ignoring him, Janovsky pulls the door with his hand, which surprisingly is not locked. The passengers head to the empty conductor's cabin at the rear while the train speeds past its final station. Luis tries to find the brake, but accidentally activates the horn, alerting the person controlling the train of his location. They try all the levers but soon realize that they cannot stop the train. Peter urges them to trust the police who might cut the power to the rail. However, Luis discovers that the train runs on diesel, so it is not as easy to stop. Then they notice a manual brake in the form of a wheel, and it seems to work. The train gradually slows down from 70 to 50 mph, with a horrible screech and sparks, and the passengers feel relieved by their success. However, the person controlling the train presses the accelerator to increase the speed to 100 miles per hour, and the sudden acceleration causes a fire. Peter once again tries to stop Luis and Janovsky, calling their actions illegal, but he receives a punch in the face in response. The passengers then turn the wheel, preventing the sparks from igniting the train. They return to the corridor and tend to Peter's and Lane's injuries. Suddenly, they realize that they are approaching a level crossing operated manually. If the police do not intervene, the train could hit a vehicle and derail. Peter repeatedly calls the police, waiting for their help. Max realizes that something is wrong, prompting Luis to explain the breakdown to him. He tells Max that the train is speeding toward the crossing, and all the passengers pray for a miracle, but it does not happen. The train crashes into the carriage at full speed and continues on its path. The police arrive too late, and are unable to do anything. After the collision, Lane feels unwell. Luis discovers that she is suffering a heart attack, and attempts to resuscitate her for about 10 minutes, but unfortunately he cannot save her. Finally, the passengers persuade Luis to leave the track, and go to the engineer in an attempt to open the door again. Luis and Janovsky try vigorously to break through the first of the two doors of the cabin with a fire extinguisher and an axe, but they do not succeed. Finally, Luis manages to break the glass of the first door. Climbing up into the lobby, he is horrified to find the ticket inspector asphyxiated. Luis calls out to the engineer to open the door and stop the train, but he gets no response. He looks through the dirty glass and notices a helmet in the cabin, the same one worn by the strange person who had previously exited the train and taken the engineer's place. Luis tries to communicate with the stranger by mentioning his little son, but the stranger remains unresponsive. Overcome by anger, Luis begins hitting the glass with the fire extinguisher and the axe, but it proves too strong. Meanwhile, the stranger continues sounding the horn, demanding that Luis stop trying to break into the cabin. Janovsky suggests that they calm down and think about what else they can do. The passengers return to their compartments and Peter mentions that the police informed him that the man on the tracks was in fact the real engineer. However, Luis insists that he saw this strange man on board, and heading toward London Bridge, is likely to have strangled the conductor, activated the emergency brake while the brakes were still working, and then released the brake pressure before taking over the engineer's cabin. Suddenly, Peter recalls an incident similar to this that happened 30 years ago, when a train arrived at a station, and instead of slowing down, crashed into the buffer stop. The engineer and 40 passengers did not survive. Rumors circulated that the engineer had deliberately caused the accident. It seems plausible that the man in the helmet intends to end his life in the same way after some time. Later, Sarah finds a technical manual in the hope of finding useful information. They have only 20 minutes left until the end of the line. Irritated by the collective inaction, John Tukovsky suggests starting a fire near the engineer's cabin to force him to come out, but Peter warns that doing so could cause the train to derail. He recalls another accident in which diesel tanks were damaged, and all the passengers died in the resulting fire. Sarah interrupts with information about the coupler that connects the carriages. Jankowski, who happens to be an engineer by training, explains how these mechanisms work. Sarah and Jankowski attempt to decouple the carriages by activating the rear manual brakes, and the train comes to a complete stop. The others support their plan. The coupler is located in a very difficult-to-reach spot, which leads Jankowski to consider going outside to try to decouple. However, Peter suggests waiting until they reach the curve, where the train will naturally slow down due to poor track conditions. Jankowski argues that it is possible the engineer will not slow down voluntarily, but Peter assures him that otherwise the train could overturn. If the stranger intends to finish things, overturning here would not be as dramatic as crashing into an intermediate stop at the end of the line. Jankowski agrees with Peter, who suggests that everyone have a drink before reaching the curve. Jankowski performs his cigarette trick again, and then prepares for his mission. Finally, Jankowski ventures outside where the cold biting wind nearly knocks him over. He reaches the coupler, but struggles to decouple the carriage. Luis watches from the compartment window as he is about to be swept away and opens the door to extend his hand. Jankowski manages to grab him, just as Sarah shouts that they are approaching a tunnel. Luis pulls Jankowski back onto the train just a second before entering the tunnel. Jankowski wakes up with a dislocated arm, but is otherwise unharmed. Unexpectedly, the train stops in the middle of the tunnel. It turns out that the police decided to use sandbags to stop the train. However, their hope of being rescued diminishes when they discover that the tunnel is single track and the door cannot be fully opened. Luis realizes that his son Max might pass through the gap, but Max in tears begs not to be sent alone into the dark tunnel. Despite Luis's insistence on saving his son, the problem is resolved only when the train begins to move again with only 10 minutes remaining until the end of the line. Jankowski suggests detonating the coupler, but they lack explosives. Then Luis comes up with an idea. He places a fire extinguisher among the luggage in the carriages, and sets it on fire in the hope that it will explode. The passengers hide behind the seats, hoping for success. The explosion occurs, but the coupler remains. Drawing closer to the explosion site, Luis sees that they can now access the coupler from the inside. He tries to decouple the carriages with his bare hands, but the hot metal prevents him from doing so. Peter comes to his aid and together they manage to separate the carriage, but Peter loses his balance and falls into the gap onto the tracks. Jankowski and Sarah rush to the manual brake, trying to slow down the train while Luis remains in a carriage engulfed in flames due to a fuel leak. Just moments before a powerful explosion, Luis jumps to a safe spot in another part of the train. It is likely that the strange person who took the engineer's place does not survive the explosion, and Jankowski and Sarah manage to stop the train. Luis loses consciousness and later regains it outside, being carried by Sarah as he sees his burning train nearby and police helicopters in the sky. Sarah informs him that she has already called an ambulance and jokes that she finally managed to get to the hospital. The surviving passengers celebrate their rescue, but the identity of the mysterious engineer remains an enigma. If you liked today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive all new updates. See you in the next video. Goodbye.